My name is Clara Martinez, and when I was 33 years old, my 14-year-old daughter Isabella collapsed in front of my entire family during what was supposed to be our annual vacation. One second, she was standing next to me, pale and quiet, trying to keep up appearances, and the next, she folded like a rag doll and hit the ground, gasping for breath while her hands clutched her stomach. Chairs scraped back and silverware clattered. But instead of rushing to help my child, my parents and my sister stared at her with the same cold disgust they had always reserved for me. My mother, Margaret, broke the silence first with a sigh that sounded rehearsed and venomous at the same time and said, "Oh, for heaven's sake, not again!" My father, Robert, slammed his palm on the table and barked, "Get up, Isabella! Stop pretending!" My sister, Veronica, leaned back in her chair, smirking, and whispered to her kids, "See what I told you, drama queen? Just like her mother." Their children snickered like hyenas circling prey while my daughter tried to breathe. That was the moment something inside me cracked wide open. I screamed for help, lifted Isabella in my arms, and ran toward the car, ignoring the mocking voices behind me. At the hospital, white lights blurred above me while doctors rushed her into emergency care. The nurse told me she needed tests immediately, appendicitis, maybe something worse, and my chest felt like it was collapsing too. I texted my family with trembling fingers and begged them to come to the hospital or at least ask how Isabella was doing. No response. Hours dragged on in silence, broken only by the beeping of hospital machines and the shallow breaths of my daughter curled up in pain. Desperate for distraction, I opened my phone, and that was when I saw it. A photo posted an hour earlier on Facebook. My parents, Robert and Margaret, lounging by the pool with margaritas in hand, my sister Veronica raising her glass to the camera, her kids grinning like they had won a prize. The caption under the picture burned into my eyes, finally having peace without the pathetic drama queen. I froze my hands, shook so hard I nearly dropped the phone. My daughter was lying in a hospital bed one hallway away from an operating room, and they were celebrating her pain like it was a show they had finally turned off. They called her pathetic, they called her a drama queen, and they toasted to her suffering. I wanted to smash the phone into the wall. I wanted to run back to the resort and shove that photo down their throats. But instead, I sat there holding my daughter's hand while rage built inside me like fire trapped in a steel box. This was not just one cruel post. It was decades of cruelty compressed into a single sentence. They had always treated me like I was worthless, but now they were aiming that poison at the only person who ever made me feel like I mattered. That was the moment I knew things would never go back to the way they were. My family had crossed a line. There was no forgiveness for mocking my child while she was being wheeled toward surgery. I looked at Isabella's pale face, her eyes squeezed shut against the pain, and I swore silently to her and to myself that this would end. They thought they could humiliate us forever, but they were wrong. They thought their control was absolute, but they had no idea what was coming. That poolside photo would become the very rope they used to hang themselves. It would be the proof of their cruelty, and I would make sure the whole world saw it. That night, sitting under the buzzing fluorescent lights of the emergency ward, I stopped being the silent daughter who swallowed insults and gaslighting. I became something else, a mother ready to fight back with every weapon at her disposal, and they would regret underestimating me. If you have ever felt betrayed by the very people who were supposed to love you most, then you already understand the storm that was crashing inside me that night. I know it sounds like the script of some cheap soap opera, but it was not fiction, it was my life unraveling in real time. And if you are watching this from anywhere in the world, whether from a quiet living room or a late-night shift break, I want you to hear me clearly. This is not just about a spoiled vacation or a petty family fight. This is about how cruelty can become tradition when no one stops it, and how silence lets abusers write the rules for decades. Maybe you have had a brother or sister who always seemed like the chosen one while you were invisible. Maybe you have been called dramatic or worthless for daring to feel pain. Maybe you have been told to stay quiet because family reputation matters more than your truth. If any of that feels familiar, buckle up because what happened after that hospital night would change everything for me and my daughter. I had spent years swallowing their insults, convincing myself that if I just stayed quiet, they would stop, but the truth is, silence only made them louder. When they posted that photo mocking my daughter while she lay in agony, I realized that the same pattern that had crushed me as a child was now aiming its claws at her, and I knew I had a choice to make. Either I let it keep happening and watch my daughter grow up believing she was worthless, or I finally became the mother she needed me to be. Every summer, my parents, Robert and Margaret, forced what they called a family tradition, a trip meant to bring us together, though. To me, it always felt more like walking into an arena where I was the underdog expected to lose. They dressed it up with words like bonding and heritage, but deep down, it was another stage for them to parade Veronica as the golden child and remind me of my permanent role as the failure. This year was no different, at least not in their eyes. They picked the destination, chose the hotel, and issued orders about who would sleep where, who would eat what, and when we would all smile for the photos. They treated the schedule like scripture, and any attempt to object was painted as selfishness. But Isabella was excited about the location she had begged to visit for months, so I swallowed my dread and agreed. That is what single mothers do, sometimes put themselves into the lion's den just to see their children smile. At the start, everything looked picture perfect. Robert strutted around like he owned the resort. Margaret barked orders about sunscreen and seating arrangements. Veronica posed for selfies with her children as if she were royalty, and her husband trailed behind her carrying bags without complaint. To any outsider, we might have looked like a typical big family enjoying summer, but inside I could feel the tension buzzing like static electricity waiting for a spark. Breakfast on the first day was the beginning. Isabella rubbed her stomach quietly and whispered, "Mom, my belly hurts." I was about to comfort her when Margaret snapped across the table. "Don't start with the drama, Isabella. We just got here." Veronica rolled her eyes and muttered lazy, just like her mother, and her kids picked up the cue chanting drama queen, until Isabella's cheeks burned red. Robert glared over his coffee and barked at me. "Control your child Clara before she ruins this trip." I clenched my fists under the table, forcing myself not to explode, and instead rubbed Isabella's back, whispering it was okay. But it was not okay, not at all. By midday, Isabella was lagging behind, pale and sweating, yet still trying to keep pace because she knew what would happen if she slowed down. When she asked to sit, Robert snapped, "Don't milk it, Isabella. Keep walking." Margaret leaned toward me and hissed loud enough for others to hear. "She always makes a scene just like you did." Veronica let out a sharp laugh and whispered something to her husband, making both of them smirk. I felt the familiar knot in my stomach, the one that told me this was not a vacation, but a battlefield where my child was now the target. That night at dinner, Isabella barely touched her food. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears as the others laughed, clinked glasses, and carried on as if nothing was wrong. Veronica leaned over to her children and whispered something that made them snicker and point at Isabella. I asked what was so funny, and they responded with that smug chorus, "Nothing. Nothing at all." And then the moment came, the one I will never forget. Isabella pushed her chair back perhaps to go to the bathroom, and then she simply folded forward, hitting the floor with a dull thud, her small body writhing in pain. For one heartbeat, the table went silent. And then Margaret sighed dramatically and muttered, "Oh, for heaven's sake, Clara, she is putting on a show again." Veronica smirked and shook her head, while Robert slammed his fist and growled, "Get her up now!" I did not wait for them to decide whether my daughter was worthy of compassion. I jumped to her side, scooped her up, and shouted for help. The hotel staff rushed in while my family sat unmoved, some even annoyed that the scene was ruining their evening. That was the moment I realized this trip had nothing to do with family bonding. It was about control domination and cruelty packaged as tradition. To them, Isabella's pain was an inconvenience, an interruption to their performance as the perfect family. To me, it was the breaking point. The ride to the hospital was a blur of sirens and fear, and my own heartbeat thundering louder than the ambulance itself. But what struck me hardest was the emptiness of the seat beside me, where no one from my so-called family sat because not one of them had bothered to come. Isabella whimpered in pain, clutching my hand so tight that my knuckles turned white, and I kept whispering, "It is okay, baby. You are safe. Mama is here." But inside, I was crumbling. When we reached the emergency room, the doctors rushed her into tests, and the fluorescent lights above me felt like interrogation lamps burning into every mistake I had ever made. I kept expecting my phone to buzz with a call from Robert or Margaret, or even Veronica, but it stayed silent. Hours passed and my daughter's pain grew worse, until finally a doctor came out and explained she had appendicitis that required immediate surgery. I nodded even as my knees shook and gave consent. They wheeled her away, and I was left staring at a set of swinging doors, terrified that I might never see her smile again. I clutched my phone like a lifeline and out of habit opened it. That was when I saw the photo. My parents lounging by the pool drinks, raised Veronica's smirk shining in the sun, her kids splashing in the water, and the caption carved into my brain. Finally having peace without the pathetic drama queen. I could not breathe. My daughter was under anesthesia, her life in danger, and my family was mocking her online for likes. The rage that filled me was not the hot rage of screaming, it was cold steel cutting through decades of submission. All my life I had endured their insults, but now it was directed at Isabella, and that was unforgivable. I wanted to storm back to the hotel and drag them to the hospital to force them to look at what real drama looked like, but instead I stayed by my daughter's side because she was what mattered. Still, the anger brewed like acid in my veins. The surgery went well, the doctor said she would recover, and relief washed over me so hard I almost collapsed too, but the fury did not leave it sharpened. The next day, I called a lawyer. While Isabella slept with an IV in her arm, I explained everything about the house my grandmother Elena had left in trust to Isabella with me as guardian. For years, I had let Robert and Margaret act like it was theirs, filling it with their rules and their cruelty. But it was not theirs, it was my daughter's. The lawyer listened carefully and assured me the law was clear. We could file eviction papers within days. My hand trembled when I signed the documents not from fear, but from the release of years of chains snapping one by one. I imagined their faces when they returned from their holiday and found the notice. For the first time in decades, I felt power humming in my chest. When Isabella woke, I smiled at her and told her everything was going to change, though I did not yet explain how. Days later, she was discharged, still weak but alive, and I drove her home to the very house that was legally hers. I placed the official letter in the center of the kitchen table like a bomb waiting to detonate. The silence in the house was heavy, but it was mine and hers, not theirs. When Robert and Margaret and Veronica finally returned from their trip, dragging suitcases and laughter through the front door, they froze at the sight of me sitting at the table, the letter spread out like evidence. Margaret snatched it up first, her face reddening with every line she read. Robert's jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might shatter. Veronica hissed, "What is this, some kind of joke?" I kept my voice calm. "It is not a joke. You have 30 days to leave this house." Their outrage exploded instantly. Margaret shrieked, "This is our house, you ungrateful child! We raised you! You owe us everything!" Robert leaned forward, his eyes burning with the same violence I had known as a child, and growled, "Tear it up, Clara, or you will regret it." Veronica slammed her hands on the table and spat. "You cannot throw family out. You will destroy us all." I met their fury with steady eyes and said, "If you care so much, Veronica, let them live with you." For the first time, her mouth snapped shut. The room filled with shouting accusations, doors slamming, cousins crying, Margaret calling me a traitor, Robert threatening that I would always be a failure. Isabella sat on the stairs pale but watching as I faced them, and I knew I could not back down. I repeated the words that had become my armor. "You have 30 days. They threw guilt threats, even tears rehearsed to perfection, but none of it moved me. My silence was stronger than their screams. That night, Robert cornered me in the hallway, his voice low and venomous, saying, "You think you have won, but you are still the same worthless girl you always were." I looked him dead in the eyes and whispered, "Maybe, but I am the worthless girl who just gave you 30 days to find a new roof." He froze, rage choking him, but powerless. For the first time in my life, I saw fear flicker in his eyes. The climax did not arrive with a single blow it built like a storm that everyone could feel coming, even if they refused to admit it. After the eviction papers landed, the house transformed into a war zone. Every morning, Robert slammed drawers and banged mugs as if noise could rewrite the law. Margaret floated around, clutching photo albums, sighing loudly enough for me to hear ungrateful over and over. Veronica arrived almost daily, pretending to mediate, but really she came to pressure me into tearing up the documents. She sat across from me, her perfume sharp, her voice colder than ice, saying, "You have made your point. Clara, now stop, before this destroys everything." I looked at her and answered flatly, "Everything was already destroyed the moment you mocked a sick child." Isabella, still weak from surgery, had to walk past their glares on her way to the bathroom, their eyes drilling into her as though she had ruined their lives simply by surviving. I wanted to shield her from every glance, but I also wanted her to see that I was no longer bowing my head. Then came the social media barrage. My cousin messaged me screenshots of Robert and Margaret posing by the front steps with boxes staged for sympathy, their caption reading, "Thrown out by our own daughter, betrayed, made homeless." The hypocrisy made me laugh out loud. They were sitting in my kitchen while posting that they were homeless. Soon, more posts appeared. Margaret clutching a photo album looking like a grieving widow, Robert on the stairs, staring tragically into the distance, Veronica writing long paragraphs about betrayal and the meaning of family. The comments poured in aunts, uncles, distant relatives scolding me, calling me cruel, selfish, heartless. Shameful, they wrote, how can she do this to her own parents? For days I held my tongue, but the bile rose higher with every message. Then one night I snapped, not with shouting, but with precision. I pulled up the poolside photo, the one captioned "Finally having peace without the pathetic drama queen," and set it side by side with their victim act. I typed, "During this family holiday, my 14-year-old daughter collapsed and was rushed to the hospital. She was diagnosed with appendicitis requiring emergency surgery. Not once did my parents or sister ask about her or visit. Instead, they posted this mocking photo. This house legally belongs to my daughter through my grandmother's will. I am her guardian, and I will not allow people who laughed at her pain to live here. That is the truth." And then I hit post. Within minutes, the tide turned. The buzzing of notifications slowed, then stopped. The relatives who had been the loudest fell silent. Some even deleted their comments. The performance was over. Robert and Margaret sat at the table when the post went live, and I watched their faces drain of color as they realized their act had collapsed in front of the entire extended family. The silence that followed was not heavy, it was clean. For the first time, the weight lifted. The turning point had arrived. They could no longer twist the narrative. They could no longer call Isabella a drama queen without proof of their own cruelty staring back at them. I had seized the story, and once it was in my hands, they were powerless. I looked across the table at Robert, his fists trembling at his sides, and Margaret clutching her chest like she had been stabbed, and Veronica glaring daggers, unable to speak. I whispered calmly, "This house is not yours. It never was. The clock is ticking." That was the moment they understood the game had changed forever. To understand why that poolside caption cut so deep, you have to rewind decades back to the very beginning, because cruelty in my family was not a sudden storm. It was the weather I grew up in. From the time I could walk, Veronica was the shining sun, the golden child who sparkled when she sneezed, and I was the shadow that trailed behind her. Robert praised her every achievement like it was proof of his greatness, and Margaret hovered over her like a queen protecting her heir. When I brought home good grades, they nodded distractedly, but when Veronica brought home the same, they threw a party. When I tried to play piano and fumbled, Margaret sighed and said, "Why can't you be more like your sister?" while Robert muttered figures. When Veronica hit a wrong note, they called it charming. By the time I was 10, I had learned that my role was not to shine, but to absorb disappointment so that Veronica could glow brighter. Robert's temper was legendary in our house, and I bore the brunt of it. If I dropped a glass, his hand would clamp on my shoulder hard enough to leave bruises. If I talked back, he would slam the table so hard I thought it might break. Margaret was subtler, but no less cruel. She would smile sweetly in public, telling neighbors how proud she was of both her daughters, then lean close at home and whisper, "You are such a burden, Clara, you always have been." Veronica drank in the favoritism like nectar and sharpened it into weapons. She called me loser, failure, nothing girl, and Robert and Margaret never corrected her. Instead, they laughed as if cruelty between siblings was just good fun. By my teenage years, I believed their verdict completely. I thought disappointment was carved into my bones. When a boy showed me attention, I clung to it even when he treated me badly because at least he noticed me. I ended up pregnant at 19, and when I told my parents, Robert turned purple and muttered figures while Margaret looked at me like I had spat on her shoes. Veronica smirked and said, "Well, at least now you finally have a purpose." They paraded me as the family cautionary tale telling cousins and neighbors what a shame I was. The child's father left almost immediately, manipulative, cruel, a mirror of Robert in younger form, and though his absence terrified me, it also freed me. For the first time, I felt something like pride, not in myself, but in the tiny baby in my arms, Isabella. She was fragile and helpless, yet when she looked at me, I felt seen in a way I never had been. Of course, Robert and Margaret weaponized even that. Single mother, they sneered, she will never amount to anything. Veronica looked at me like I was a walking warning sign. But then came my grandmother Elena, Margaret's mother, the only one who ever looked at me without disappointment clouding her eyes. She was frail by then, but sharp-minded, and she adored Isabella. She would cradle her, whispering to her, beam at her like she was the center of the universe, and I would watch with an ache in my chest, thinking, so this is what love is supposed to look like. When Elena passed, everyone assumed the house would go to Margaret. After all, she was the daughter, and Robert strutted as if the deed already bore his name. Veronica was already redesigning the rooms in her head. But Elena was not blind. She had seen their cruelty. She had seen me bent under the weight of their scorn. And she had seen Isabella's light. So she did the unthinkable. She left the house to Isabella in trust with me as guardian until she came of age. When the will was read, Robert shouted confusion. Margaret wailed betrayal. Veronica hissed about tradition, but I sat there stunned, holding the paper in my trembling hands while Isabella played on the floor. It was not mine, not theirs, it was hers, and suddenly everything made sense. Elena had known that if the house went to Margaret, the cycle would never break. By leaving it to Isabella, she had given me a weapon sharper than any insult. But here is the truth. When you have been told all your life that you are worthless, you do not wake up one morning filled with power. I did not throw them out. I did not wave the deed in their faces. Instead, I tucked it away and told myself, it is still their house, don't rock the boat. So, Robert and Margaret continued to rule, filling the rooms with their rules, their voices, their judgment, while I raised Isabella in the same walls where I had been raised to believe I was nothing. Every time Robert sighed at me, every time Margaret whispered disappointment, every time Veronica visited with her perfect life and her perfect children, it was the same chorus: failure, failure, failure. I endured it, but what haunted me was the thought of Isabella watching me endure it. I lay awake at night terrified she would believe what I once believed, that she was a burden, that cruelty was normal, that her worth could be measured in sighs and rolled eyes. And when she collapsed at that dinner table and they mocked her pain, everything in me screamed, this ends now, because it was no longer just about me. It was about the one person who had ever made me feel like I mattered, and I swore she would never grow up swallowing disappointment as her daily meal. After Isabella's surgery, when the doctor assured me she would recover, I sat in that sterile hospital room watching her chest rise and fall under thin blankets. And something inside me shifted permanently. For years, I had convinced myself that keeping quiet was safer, that swallowing insults was easier than starting a war. But staring at my daughter's fragile body stitched from emergency surgery while my parents toasted by the pool, I realized silence was just another cage they had built for me. And cages could be broken. When we returned home, I carried Isabella inside, and the house felt different. It was still full of their scent, their noise, their dominance, but I knew a secret they refused to acknowledge. This house was not theirs, it was Isabella's. Elena had given her a shield, and I was finally ready to wield it. That night, after tucking Isabella into bed, I sat at the kitchen table with the will in my hands and dialed a lawyer. My voice was steady, too steady, as I explained the trust, the conditions, and the fact that my parents had been living here without legal claim. The lawyer listened and told me calmly that the law was on my side. We could issue formal eviction papers within a week. I signed everything with hands that shook not from fear, but from the release of years of submission draining away. I imagined Robert's face purple with rage, Margaret's shrieks Veronica's cold fury, and for the first time, instead of shrinking, I welcomed the thought. While Isabella recovered, I prepared. I cleaned the house quietly, not like a servant, but like a soldier readying the battlefield. I placed the official letter in the center of the table, like a landmine waiting to detonate. Every time I walked past it, my heart beat faster, but instead of dread, it was anticipation. For once, I was not waiting to be humiliated, I was waiting to watch them fall. I kept silent. No dramatic declarations, no warnings, just calm, cold patience. I let them enjoy their holiday, posting selfies, cocktails, clinking laughter echoing across social media. Every caption they wrote felt like a weapon aimed at me and Isabella, but I did not flinch because I knew the real weapon was waiting on that table inked in black and white. When Isabella smiled weakly at me one evening and whispered, "Are they still at the pool?" I kissed her forehead and said, "Let them enjoy it while it lasts." Inside, I was already counting down. 30 days, that was all they would have once they walked through that door. 30 days to pack 30 days to taste the bitterness they had forced down my throat for decades. I was not just planning to kick them out, I was planning to end the cycle forever. The day they returned, the house felt like it was holding its breath. I sat at the kitchen table with the eviction notice spread out before me, the air thick with anticipation. The front door opened, suitcases scraped across the floor, and laughter spilled in. Robert walked in first, his face smug and sunburned, Margaret behind him with a shopping bag in each hand, Veronica trailing like a queen with her children in tow. Their laughter stopped cold when they saw me waiting. Margaret spotted the letter first and snatched it up, her eyes scanning the words before her face flushed crimson. "What is this?" she shrieked, her voice sharp enough to rattle the glasses in the cabinet. Robert took it from her, his jaw tightening with every line. "This is a joke," he barked, tossing the paper back at me. Veronica stepped forward, her eyes blazing. "Clara, stop this madness now. You cannot possibly mean it." My hands were steady as I folded the paper once and set it down again. "You have 30 days. The explosion was immediate. Margaret wailed betrayal, screaming. "How dare you, after everything we have done for you, after raising you, you ungrateful brat." Robert slammed his fist on the table so hard, the cups rattled and growled. "Tear it up now, Clara, or I swear you will regret this." Veronica sneered. "This is family. You do not throw family out." Her children stared wide-eyed, whispering to each other like they were watching a play they had not rehearsed for. Isabella had crept halfway down the stairs, pale from her recent surgery, but determined to witness, and I felt her eyes on me and knew I could not falter. "If you care so much, Veronica," I said coldly, "let them live with you." She froze her mouth open, then shut again, no words coming out. The argument raged for hours. Margaret hurled insults, calling me heartless, a failure, a traitor. Robert spat venom, leaning so close I could smell the alcohol on his breath, saying, "You think this makes you strong." "Clara, but you are still nothing. You always were nothing." I looked him in the eye and answered, "Maybe, but I am the nothing who just gave you 30 days to find a new roof." He recoiled as though I had struck him. Veronica stormed about. Tradition, culture, respect, screaming that Elena had been confused when she wrote the will. I stayed calm, repeating the same line like steel. "You have 30 days!" They threw every weapon they had. Guilt threats, promises, tears, rehearsed as though they had practiced them in front of a mirror. Margaret sobbed, clutching a photo album, whispering, "How can you do this to your own mother?" Robert shouted about betrayal of blood. Veronica slammed doors, shouted about destroying the family legacy. Their children cried in confusion. Through it all, I remained still, a rock in the storm. At one point, Robert grabbed my arm, his grip iron tight, the same grip he had used to punish me as a child. For a second, old fear rose in my throat, but then I saw Isabella's terrified eyes from the stairs, and that fear melted into fury. "Touch me again, and I will call the police," I hissed, my voice calm and deadly. He let go slowly, his face purple with rage, but something flickered there too, something that looked like fear. Margaret screeched ungrateful again and again as though repetition could make it true. Veronica tried pleading. lowering her voice, telling me to think of appearances, telling me people would talk. I answered, "People already are, and I will not let them write my daughter's story with lies." Silence fell like a hammer. They realized I meant it. The confrontation dragged late into the night, accusations echoing down the hallway, but by dawn, their energy was spent. Margaret retreated to her room, sobbing theatrically. Robert stomped off, muttering curses. Veronica slammed the door as she left, dragging her children behind her. I climbed the stairs to Isabella, tucked her in, kissed her forehead, and whispered, "They have 30 days," and for the first time she smiled weakly, her eyes shining with relief. That night, as I lay awake, I realized I had crossed the line. There was no going back, but I also realized I did not want to go back. The house felt different already, not yet free, but trembling on the edge of freedom. The clock was ticking, and it was finally on my side. The war did not end with the confrontation at the table, it only shifted battlegrounds. Robert and Margaret turned the house into a theater, staging their victimhood for anyone who would listen. They posed at the front steps with boxes carefully arranged, and Margaret clutching a photo album while Robert stared off tragically into the distance, and Veronica posted the photo online with the caption thrown out by our own daughter, "Betrayed, made homeless." The comments came flooding in, extended family piling on with accusations. How could she do this to her parents? Shameful, heartless, doesn't she know what family means? For days, my phone buzzed with venom from cousins, aunts, uncles, all parroting the same words. Margaret and Robert sat in the kitchen while these comments poured in, pretending to sip tea but smirking like they had already won. Isabella walked past them each morning on her way to school, and their eyes followed her with silent blame as though she had personally destroyed their lives. I stayed silent outwardly, but inside the rage built sharp and precise. I had held my tongue long enough. One night, after another flood of hateful messages from relatives, I opened my laptop and pulled up their poolside photo, the one captioned, "Finally having peace without the pathetic drama queen." I set it side by side with their staged photo of victimhood and wrote my truth. During this family holiday, my 14-year-old daughter collapsed and was rushed to the hospital. She was diagnosed with appendicitis requiring emergency surgery. Not once did my parents or my sister ask about her or visit her. Instead, they posted this mocking photo. "This house legally belongs to my daughter through my grandmother's will. I am her guardian. I will not allow people who laughed at her pain to live here. That is the truth." And then I hit post. The effect was immediate, like pulling the pin on a grenade. My notifications exploded, then went eerily silent. The relatives who had shouted the loudest suddenly vanished. Some deleted their comments, others messaged quietly, apologizing, saying they hadn't known the full story. Robert and Margaret sat frozen at the table when the post went live, their faces draining of color as they realized the world could now see the truth. Veronica stormed in the next morning, demanding to know why I had humiliated them publicly, but her voice lacked its usual venom. She knew the battle had shifted out of their control. For once, the narrative was mine and they could not twist it. I watched as their performance collapsed around them like a stage set crumbling to the ground. No more posts followed. The stream of public sympathy dried up, leaving only silence and shame. For the first time in my life, silence was not a weapon against me, it was my victory. When the 30 days finally ended, the house was no longer a battlefield, but a graveyard for their pride. Robert and Margaret packed their things in bitter silence, moving slowly as though dragging out each hour might undo the deadline. Margaret sobbed theatrically while filling boxes, clutching family heirlooms as if they might anchor her to the house by force of sentiment. Robert stomped through the halls, muttering curses, each word aimed like a dart at my back. Veronica came to help, her voice sharp with anger. "You have made your point. Clara, now stop this madness before it ruins everything." But her husband hovered in the background, his face tight with resentment because he knew what was coming when her parents landed under his roof. I said nothing more. I had already spoken the only words that mattered. "You have 30 days. On the final morning, they carried the last boxes out without ceremony. No more posts, no more staged photos, just the slam of car doors and the squeal of tires fading down the street. The silence that followed was not empty. It was alive. The walls seemed to breathe for the first time. I walked through each room, slowly touching the walls, the door frames, the windows, and realized they no longer belonged to Robert's fury or Margaret's sighs or Veronica's sneers. They belonged to Isabella. Upstairs, I found her stretched on her bed, sketchbook in her lap. She looked up at me and asked softly, "Are they really gone?" "Yes, I said they are gone." She smiled, tired but genuine, and whispered, "It feels different already." It did. Life shifted overnight. With the house free of their poison, the air felt lighter. Isabella healed not just from her surgery, but from the constant sting of ridicule. She laughed more she dared to invite friends over without fearing what her grandparents would say. I rented one of the spare rooms to a quiet tenant and cut back my hours at work, finally able to spend evenings with my daughter instead of collapsing from exhaustion. For the first time in years, we were not just surviving, we were living. Word spread through the family that Robert and Margaret had moved in with Veronica, and chaos erupted almost immediately. Too many people under one roof, too much ego and resentment. Veronica's husband bristled at their presence, and within months, the shouting matches grew legendary. Doors slammed, dishes shattered, insults flew. Eventually, Veronica herself cracked, throwing them out in a storm of rage. Robert and Margaret ended up in a cramped rental on the edge of town, far from the house they once thought of as their kingdom. Their fall was complete. Once they had strutted through my halls like rulers, now they lived in obscurity, clinging to whatever scraps of pride remained. And me, I did not visit. I did not call. I did not check in. The tie was severed. Occasionally, I saw their names on social media, but the comments were sparse, the sympathy gone. People had seen the truth, and there was no repairing the damage. The consequences were not mine to carry, they were theirs. As months passed, I felt something unfamiliar peace. I watched Isabella blossom in the quiet of our reclaimed home, and each day her smile reminded me why I had fought. Justice had not come with shouting or fists. It had come with patience and precision, exposing their cruelty and forcing them to face the consequences of their own choices. I often thought of Elena and her decision to leave the house to Isabella. She had known what I did not, that one day I would need leverage, that one day silence would no longer be enough. Her gift had broken the cycle. Looking back, I realized that my parents had always believed control was theirs forever, but in the end, it was paper, ink, and truth that unraveled them. I closed this chapter not with forgiveness, but with resolve. To anyone trapped in a toxic family, hear this: silence keeps you prisoner, but action sets you free. They called my daughter a pathetic drama queen, but today she rules her own home with laughter, not fear. And that is the only legacy that matters. So tell me, after hearing everything, do you think I went too far or not far enough? Because some people might say families should be forgiven no matter what, but I believe blood does not excuse cruelty, and loyalty should never be demanded. It should be earned. My parents and my sister spent years crushing me with words and mocking my daughter's pain, and when they finally faced consequences, they called themselves victims. But I know what really happened, and now you do too. Maybe you have faced something similar. Maybe you have been told to stay quiet for the sake of family image. Maybe you have been called dramatic for daring to feel pain. If so, let this story be a reminder that you are not alone and that there is power in standing up even when your voice shakes. I fought back not with fists but with truth and with law, and it was enough to shatter decades of control. Silence had been my cage, but action became my freedom. I would love to know what you think, so share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you believe justice and truth deserve to be heard, then make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and stay with me for more stories where cruelty meets its consequences and where silence finally breaks.